Well, fam, some breaking news this morning that is a little insane. Not something I had on my bingo list, to say the very least. But you can see Sony is in talks to buy media powerhouse behind Elden Ring. This is a company called Kadokawa. Close enough. I'm going to run with it. And it's basically a massive multimedia conglomerate out of Japan. They've gone through a handful of mergers in the last decade or so, but basically they're a multi-billion-dollar corporation that specializes in different forms of media and entertainment. So everything from manga to comic books. They apparently run a bunch of magazines in Japan, and apparently magazines are still decently big there. And of course, they own FromSoftware. A lot of people get confused and they mix up publishing versus ownership. So people think that Bandai Namco owned FromSoftware because they published their games for years. But that's not actually the case. They used to partner with Bandai Namco to publish their games, but recently they notably regained all complete control of their franchises, or rather specifically Elden Ring. But they're looking, at least as of this point, they've been looking to self-publish. They're big enough that they can do that now. They don't need outside help. And Sony owns, this is why it's kind of weird. Sony owns a little bitty sliver of Kadokawa. I'll run with it. They own a little sliver. As you can see, they own about a 2% stake in the company and a stake in FromSoftware. FromSoftware, their stake in that company is bigger technically, but still not controlling or anything close to it. They just own a sizable chunk. As you can see here, Kadokawa owns about 70%, Six Joy Hong Kong owns 16%, and Sony owns about 14% of FromSoftware. So for them to acquire the parent company would be to take complete, or at least controlling interest in FromSoftware. They would still owe 16% of royalties and stuff to Sixjoy unless there's some agreement that they can force a purchase. In a lot of corporations, there's stuff in the organizing documents that says a controlling member of the board or a controlling group within the board can order that we buy out this partner. So if you have 2/3 of the board or 2/3 of the owners saying, hey, we want to buy you out because we're going to consolidate and we're going to sell off or something, sometimes you can force that, but who knows? I don't have their operating documents. I don't have any of that stuff, so I don't know what they're limited by. But the point is, there's a lot of people with their hands in the pots here. But if we look at the actual article, you can see New York/Tokyo, November 19th, just breaking from Reuters. Sony is in talks to acquire Kadokawa, the Japanese media powerhouse behind the Elden Ring game. Two sources familiar with the matter said as the technology giant looks to add to its entertainment portfolio. The talks between the two sides are ongoing, and if successful, a deal could be signed in the coming weeks. Now, I believe that, its market cap is around 2.7 billion. After this, they happen to spike up 23-ish% from where they were just on the news of a potential buyout. They've had some troubles recently in the last couple of years with some of their businesses not doing so great. And this is why it's important for us to remember that big companies like this are not just a single thing. They're not a monolith. Yes, this corporation owns FromSoftware, and FromSoftware is super successful, but Kadokawa also happens to have 5,200 employees or something like that. It's a massive company. FromSoftware is 400 something employees, and Kadokawa has, I think, 5,000, 5,200 or 5,300 or something. So it's just a massive, massive company. And for Sony to buy them out is a big deal because it certainly would help their operations in the gaming side of things. But the other reason they're buying them is for their different slivers of media, manga, magazines, multimedia. That's why they're interested in it. What I found interesting about this, though, is Sony declined to comment when asked, are you buying them out? Excuse me, Finley. And Kadokawa said they cannot comment. So they didn't even just go, we're not going to comment on this. They said, we can't. we can't talk about it. Which is kind of talking about it, you know, like that's basically just admitting it. Very, very interesting. Honestly, I think this makes a lot of sense. I mean, out of any of the companies that Sony could target for an acquisition that would be consequential, I think this is probably the biggest and most important one. The prospect of having a future Bloodborne sequel or Elden Ring sequel or something exclusive to PlayStation, I think that that is a big W for them in terms of the business. Now, there's a difference between that and what I personally want. Like, if I were the almighty God emperor of gaming, I would not be doing all of these like mergers, all these acquisitions, because I do not think that having a few very massive publishers leads to a better gaming industry. I think the way that you keep the gaming industry healthy is with pure competition. I think the age of like the late 2000s leading into the PS4 and 360, or rather Xbox One generation, I think that that was like prime time. There were tons of studios, tons of smaller publishers that were interested in putting a lot of money into exciting new projects, taking risks, and it was highly, highly, highly competitive, and that worked. Here, I mean, I understand why they're doing it, and I can appreciate the business choice to do this, but I also think that this probably is not actually that healthy for the industry at large. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter what I think. They're going to do what they're going to do no matter what. So do I think that this likely goes through? Honestly, if they actually are in talks, which this heavily suggests that they are, and Reuters doesn't just make stuff up. I mean, Reuters is very good at what they do. I would suspect that this is real, and that this does actually materialize into something. It's probably not a clear-cut buyout like what Microsoft has historically done, where they just pay cash or they pay stock for a given company. It's probably a little bit more complicated than that, where maybe they do like a merger and they acquire these segments of the business and sell off these segments. Sony, you know, their corporate leadership is very, very savvy, and so they're very capable of coming up with clever ways of doing things. There's parts of Kadokawa Kadokawa that I think that they probably are not that interested in, frankly, but maybe they surprise me and they just buy it out cleanly. But pretty insane. I mean, pretty insane. You could see Sony has a market value of about 114 billion. And this next bit is something we talked about on stream earlier this year, but has since been kind of forgotten. Sony was in talks to merge its Indian side of its company with Z Entertainment Enterprises, which was going to be like a $10 billion deal. It was going to be a massive merger. It was going to be huge. It's going to be huge, dare I say. But it ended up collapsing, and it kind of went back and forth on why it collapsed, but it seemed as though maybe there were financial elements and things that were not disclosed to them initially about the company. And when that was disclosed, they backed out. So you can see like this company, Z Entertainment, out of India, they're riding high. And then the second it's announced that Sony's not going through with it, the stock crashes a lot. And then they recover a little bit, but it's just been dropping ever since. And it's probably because there were some things they discovered that they weren't super thrilled with in terms of the valuations and stuff. But that freed up a lot of money that the board had already kind of mentally set aside for an acquisition or for some expansion. And honestly, you know, does Elden Ring's developer is FromSoftware as a studio worth $3 billion? No. I mean, I know we all love FromSoftware games, but $3 billion is live service studio money. I mean, that's what they paid for Bungie, and we all know how that went. But that's what you pay for like a massive, massive company with tons of live service potential, mobile games, all that stuff. ZeniMax was $7 billion, and they had many different pots on the stove. They had mobile games, they had live service games, they had big single player games and developers, tons of different stuff. And FromSoftware is just one. And that's why you can't just look at this potential acquisition through the lens of paying $3 billion for FromSoftware, even though that's kind of what the headlines are becoming is that's why they're interested in it. And that's a huge part of it. But the other reason that they're interested in this is because they potentially want access to all of the other sides of media, all the magazines, all the manga, all of that stuff that we in the West may not be too familiar with, but certainly does have a bigger role to play in the Japanese market. Because that's a really easy thing to forget, is that Sony is a huge company and they do a lot of different stuff. They not just focus on video games. PlayStation is their biggest market segment, but a ton of their money comes from making and designing cameras. A ton of the money comes from film and TV. And a lot of their money also comes from like insurance. They have a huge insurance business that accounts for like 12 to 20% of their annual revenue. Don't lick my drink, please. Thank you, buddy. They make a ton of money through insurance, like life insurance policies and stuff. Sony does. So even though you may not be familiar with those little more niche segments of their business, doesn't mean that they're not there. And here, I'm sure that there's other stuff that they are considering that could make this a very, very viable purchase that can make a lot of financial sense. So we'll keep an eye on it. I think it's a good get for them in terms of the PlayStation side of things. But at $3 billion US, roughly, because they're going to pay above whatever the current trading price is. That's how acquisitions tend to work for companies that are healthy and not in crisis. I mean, they are going to need to either get a good deal on it, or they're going to need to have some other angle to this. Maybe the manga side of the business, or the magazines or comics and stuff, maybe that is a big enough business that they can justify this price. But $3 billion is a lot of cash money. And as much as I love Elden Ring, Elden Ring maybe made like about $1 billion in revenue. That does not mean that it made $1 billion in profit. And that's a key thing to understand, is $1 billion in revenue does not mean profit. And when you're talking about 3 to 4 years between major releases, you got to be very aware of how much money you're spending and when you can expect to recoup it back. And then, of course, there's the added factors such as risk and things like that. But if this goes through, if they get it, I think this pretty much guarantees a theory I've had for a long time, which is that the successor to Bloodborne, whether that's a remake or a remaster or a straight up sequel, I think that comes at the launch of the PlayStation 6 generation, and this times out just about perfectly. If they were to buy them out sometime by the end of this year, they make the announcement late November or early December, they take over at FromSoftware, they walk in, they say, hey, you guys are going to make Bloodborne 2 for us, or you're going to remake it or whatever, and they're going to say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, whatever, you are the new owners, and they're going to have 3 to 4 years to work on that before the PlayStation 6 launches, probably in 2028, in which case it lines up just about perfectly. So it's going to be really interesting. We'll keep an eye on it. I can't wait to see what happens. Again, not my favorite thing. If I were the almighty emperor, I would not have all these mergers and acquisitions be happening, but I'm not. So we're just here for the ride. But if Sony can close this, it'll be a big deal. He took my thing.